Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Delbur Rohach and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by my friend
Giselle Donnelly. I'm also at AEI, and
Julia Joja with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities.
On our podcast, we talk about the many challenges to European peace and security that have erupted along a line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why those matter to the United States. Our special guest today is Tamar Jacobi, the director of the New Ukraine Project at the Progressive Policy Institute and author of Ukraine's Other Front, The War on Corruption, a new report that has just come out with PPI. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. Tamar, it's great to have you back on the podcast. You spent much of the past 18 months in Ukraine or in close proximity to Ukraine, doing journalistic work and seeing how things sort of unfolded on many different fronts. And one of the issues that have been of interest to you is obviously this question of corruption and the institutional strength of Ukraine. There is this trope in America, particularly in Ukraine skeptical circles, that it's a hopelessly corrupt country and whatever aid is being sent to Ukraine ends up in a sort of bottomless money pit. And 5 days later, as the famous Twitter meme indicates, we'll have President Zelensky asking for more. So why is this a really wrong-headed way of thinking about Ukraine's corruption problem and the role of Western assistance?
Dalibor, thank you so much, and to all of you, thanks for having me back. And that's exactly why I wanted to look into the corruption issue in Ukraine, because it is such a in a way barrier really to U.S. help, and it's such a long old stereotype, and it's not only a stereotype. Let's be candid from the start. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union for 70 years, and in the Soviet command and control shortage economy, in some ways corruption was the only way to get by. You had to barter and bribe in order to get basic services and food. So Ukraine did inherit an awful legacy of corruption, and we have to start by being honest about that. But what's important, really, is that reformers in Ukraine, young Ukrainians, people who want to join Europe, have been fighting this corruption, not for a few weeks, not for a few months, but for fully 10 years, a full-on fight in Ukraine to push back these old bad habits. And like any bad habits, they're learned and they're unlearnable. And these reformers, who are no longer so young, it's 10 years later, have made enormous progress in that decade. The struggle to beat back corruption wasn't over when the full-scale invasion happened. But paradoxically, unexpectedly, really surprising to many, instead of putting that fight on hold, the war has accelerated that fight in the biggest way, and really boosted into the stratosphere. And Ukraine is making, twice as fast strides now to beat that corruption. It's not over. This is work that will remain to be done, as building democracy will remain to be done after the fighting is over. But Ukraine has come a long way, and Ukrainians are now determined that fight really must be won, and that their sons and brothers are not dying for an old Soviet-style corrupt society.
Could you point us to specific sort of institutional changes and reforms that occurred after 2014 and show us how they have made the difference to how corruption is tackled?
Yeah, well, sure. So let's start there. So 2014, obviously, for those who don't follow Ukraine so closely, was the Maidan Revolution of Dignity, and 1 million people came into the street to demand to join Europe. And part of what motivated them, and one of the main motivations, was they wanted to get rid of the old Soviet legacies, including corruption. So in the aftermath of Maidan, when the revolution was successful, a lot of changes were made quickly. Institutions were created, a cluster of institutions that would investigate, detectives, prosecutors, and a court that would investigate corrupt crimes of corruption. A system was established where all public procurement was done online on an open platform, so that every paperclip that a parliamentary office orders, or mayor or a city hospital or whatever, it's online, where they bought it and how much they paid and what are the details of the contractor who they bought it from. There was also a system where all public officials, from the president down to the lowest, new hire at a security service, has to file what's called an asset declaration, where days worth of filling out forms about everything you own, everything you've earned, down to your car and your watch and the wines in your basement if you have any. So lots of particularly e-online, e-government systems, and these institutions that were the detectives the FBI helped train the detectives. So these institutions went to work, and meanwhile, the young reformers formed a kind of watchdog democratic opposition that used these online tools to put pressure on the corrupt officials. It was a battle for 10 years because the corrupt officials also had a lot at their disposal. They were judges. They owned the media. Half of between a third and 40% more of the parliament answered to a corrupt oligarch. The oligarchs basically owned all the big industries. So the other side had a lot to push back with. And by the way, Russia was helping the other side all along, because Russia liked the idea of a corrupt Ukraine where they could pull strings. So there was a 10-year battle. And by February 2022, when the full-scale invasion happened, I would have called it about 50-50. Like the reformers had created an incredible infrastructure, but there were still ways for the old guard to, put the wrong people in charge of the institutions, for example, or to use other arms of government to get around the institutions. But what the EU did, well, three things happened in the war. One is that the fighting destroyed about nearly a third to a half of the wealth of the oligarchs. So suddenly the oligarchs are much less powerful. And wartime reform of the media took away their TV stations. All the TV stations had been controlled by oligarchs, and now they didn't have that instrument anymore. So the oligarchs have been temporarily tamed. Big, important wartime change we can talk more about. Second big, important wartime change is the EU and the international pressure, which has been very focused and very specific and very intelligent and informed. And the EU has looked at the institutions that were in place and the reforms that were ongoing, and it has really figured out the next step in almost every case and insisted on that next step happening, a pivotal key next step for any advancement of membership talks. So, for example, these institutions, the Bureau of Detectives and the prosecutors, EU said, great, those are nice institutions, but the leadership isn't strong enough. And we need to see stronger leadership picked in a more transparent, open, democratic, trustworthy, reliable way. And sure enough, that happened. And a combination of that and advances on the court, the anti-corruption court that investigates the cases that these institutions find, that whole structure of institutions has suddenly gone into high gear, where it was kind of limping along and hampered at every turn before the full-scale invasion. Now it's roaring, and in the best way. Investigating cases, prosecuting cases, trying cases, getting verdicts. I mean, there have been more verdicts in the last couple of years than in, decades previously against judges and others. So we had the oligarchs temporary taming of the oligarchs, the strengthening of the institutions, thanks primarily to thanks to this very clever intervention of the EU, and then there's been a big shift in public opinion. As I was alluding to a minute ago, before the full-scale invasion, I think a lot of people were fatalistic, kind of saying, well, this is a corrupt country, it's like what can we do? It's kind of like the weather, we live with it. But since tens of thousands of men and boys and women, in fact, have died for the idea of this country, people have started to say, we're not dying, we haven't lost our houses, our families aren't dying, we're not going through this for the sake of the old, corrupt, Soviet-style regime, and we want something new. And there was a great moment a few weeks ago where these asset declarations had been suspended by martial law, and the public started to clamor and said, we want to see those asset declarations again. We want to know what public officials are making and what they own. And at first the RADA, like they always used to do, stalled and hemmed and hawed and dragged their feet and carried on. And then they passed a law that was only like half a law. Like, okay, we have to file the asset declarations now, but the public can't see them. And in 2 hours, 80,000 people signed a petition to Zelensky saying, open up those asset declarations. We want to see them. And you better believe it. He acted, in haste and did that. And so, again, what we see there is the combination of the taming of the oligarchs, the EU having set up the conditions. I mean, the asset declarations had been a long time demand of the EU and the IMF, and then this new public political will. And it's really, I think it's moving mountains, and it doesn't mean it's over, but I think it's really important. And I think that, the US, as we consider aid, we need to think about what the EU has done and think about following that, doing the same. I mean, the Ukrainian reformers want the aid to come with conditions, not military aid and not emergency humanitarian aid, but they want membership in international bodies, and they want, reconstruction assistance. They want that all conditioned on reform so that the reformers have that extra leverage over that old guard, which, everyone knows is still lying there waiting to bounce back and fight back.
It seemed to me also recently that, I wish you would evaluate this thought, that the dismissal of Defense Minister Reznikov was really a transform. That was another level of not only in the formal anti-corruption campaign, but to your point about public opinion, and not only about the reaction to public opinion, but sort of the preemptive reaction to public opinion. I mean, here was a man who was the symbol of Ukrainian battlefield success, was doing a very fine job as defense minister from all we know. Highly respected, almost beloved in the West for have the relationships that he'd established with his counterparts and, defense intellectuals. He was, well regarded by the people who are closely following the war, an intimate of Zelensky himself. And there was no, or at least I haven't seen so far, any intimation that he himself was corrupt, but the charge really was that he was not sufficiently attentive to corruption within the military procurement system and therefore had to be dismissed. I mean, that's a level of, certainly the Nixon administration wouldn't have done something like that.
Well, I mean, also what's striking is it's just like how, like by Ukrainian pre-war standards, petty the sort of charges looked.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
true. That's true. Just a couple of caveats. I mean, what he mainly did wrong was he stonewalled when the media came at him when the corruption came to light, and and it was pretty petty corruption, right? We're overpaying for eggs and buying the wrong kind of coats. I mean, it's not good, but it's it wasn't like bribing a major judge or whatever. But he stonewalled when the media came investigating. He kind of crossed his arms and said, security, get away. And that was seen as the sin. I think it was important and an important signal to move against him. And noteworthy that Zelensky did it on the same basically week that he also went after his former patron, maybe even more important, the oligarch who owned the TV channel where his TV show had appeared before he was president, and the oligarch that basically paid for his campaign, financed his campaign. So, that was in some ways even a more striking personal, I'm willing to go after my close circle. But I think the reformers in Ukraine, and, if I may try to channel them, I think they would say, great, important symbol, important communication, but let's be careful that this doesn't become like man-to-man fighting, sort of. That, Zelensky firing somebody in his inner circle, that's a good sign, but really we need to go through the institutions, and we need to use the institutions, and we need to strengthen the institutions. And, one powerful guy fighting back against another powerful guy, that's the way it's always worked. That going back to when the party was the elite, not the oligarchs. And so, important step, but really the important steps are strengthening those institutions and strengthening the framework of legality and constitutional checks and balances. And that's, Zelensky had an anti-oligarch law. He was the first president who was able to pass any anti-oligarch measures. He passed an anti-oligarch law, I think, in 2020. And the Venice Commission just, overruled it and basically said that's not the way to go about it, because his way of going about it was, we're gonna identify 12 strongmen, and then we're gonna prevent them from doing things. And the Venice Commission said that punitive personal approach is not the way to do it. We need systemic reforms that really change the system. And it doesn't, Zelensky's a brilliant communicator, and he communicated with the Reznikov firing, and you heard it loud and clear. And I think a lot of people did, including Ukrainians. But it's not. I'm not saying that shouldn't happen, but the other longer term stuff is also really, really, really important.
First of all, Tamar, I want to thank you for putting together a picture that we're missing. Giselle and Dalibor are right about the Reznikov case as being the most visible we've seen, and the communication around it was very powerful. But the story that you're telling about EU institution building and most of all, the pushback from civil society over the last decade, and particularly since the full-scale invasion, that despite having a number of think tanks looking into, in DC, looking into anti-corruption efforts, we do not see that story at all, and we don't see it in the media neither. And so kudos for telling it so compellingly, because we need more on that. I want to build on the EU part and highlight that a little bit, and basically ask you about EU versus the United States. So you are, as we are aware, that we have a narrative building here that is wrong for several reasons about Ukraine being just corrupt and bottomless, as we mentioned at the beginning of this episode. And we've seen over the last few weeks the United States, or it's been leaked, right? These 3-4 pages from the Biden administration about basically conditionality for aid. And in itself, of course, that's good, because the civil society in Ukraine welcomes any kind of checks and balances and any kinds of support from the West for the fight against corruption. But the United States, to be frank, has less experience and less instruments, institution building, compared to the European Union. And the European Union has been around for a decade. And not only that, but we've seen neighboring countries, particularly Poland, at the local level, offering their expertise and their experience, and not only Poland, in terms of institution building and integration into the EU as progress. So how do you see this? Is it just a political instrument from the United States to kind of calm the spirits here? You've looked at the content. Is it doubling with the EU? Is it welcomed in terms of technical pressure, or in double pressure as well? How help us make sense of it. Where's the United States there?
Yeah. Well, let's start with the welcome part. I mean, let's talk about civil society for a second. So, and civil society can mean many things. In Ukraine, it means both the public will at large, but also these, dozen or so leading reform institutions that are really the country's democratic opposition. And they're very, very important, because they know the landscape, and they really are the voice of change and have been driving change for 10 years. So again, I do tend to listen to them. they beg the West for help. I mean, I had organized a dinner in Brussels where we brought a civil society activist to meet members of the European Parliament, and they were sort of saying, well, maybe we should go easy on this provision of the conditions. Maybe it's okay if you do it sort of we take some shortcuts to get there. And the civil society activists were begging them, don't do that. Don't let us off the hook. Don't ease up on that conditionality. Imagine any kind of fight where it's a standoff and two sides are, just at equal pressure. Somebody giving a little nudge in the right direction can really make a difference. And that's what the civil society activists keep saying. The conditions really matter. So I've certainly heard many say they want, for example, NATO membership conditioned on reform. I mean, people would have been very disappointed if Zelensky had come home from Vilnius with forgive the phrase, but a blank check. And NATO membership assured. People want conditionality attached to it. That said, there's certainly a danger that U.S. politicians acting politically, could put the wrong kind of conditions on. But my advice would be consult with the civil society activists and EU people who know the landscape and craft something tactical and effective the way the EU conditions have been. The EU conditions aren't perfect, but they've built a roadmap for Ukraine to follow and put conditionality at just these very strategic points. And the US, I think, should try to do the same. I mean, we need to be careful. Again, I have a personal stake in this. I don't want the Patriot missiles, conditioned on something that's not achievable, but that are protecting my apartment. But so it's about doing it well. It's about doing it doing it in the right way and consulting with the people on the ground who know. But I don't think friends of Ukraine do Ukraine any favor to say let's go easy, because the point is that this war is people are dying for a new country, for a new Western, effective, modern country, and they're at least half of Ukrainians are actively, every Ukrainian you speak to understands that and talks about that. We're not helping them if we say, oh, it's okay, we'll help you fight, but we're not going to help you get to that democratic, market economy, Western-oriented market economy that you want. So I think it's your concerns are well-grounded. American policymakers do a lot of sloppy things in the name of politics, but it's not a bad aim to have conditionality.
The track record, say in Afghanistan and Iraq, is of American efforts in this regard is not particularly cheery. It was the case in you couldn't have a better example than the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, which became kind of a rogue institution entirely on its own and saw its job really to dig up dirt and really little beyond that. It did not offer recommendations for improvements. And I would even be skeptical of the State Department's capacity to do what the EU has had to learn to do over the past. You're getting EU praise from me, so mark this date in your calendars.
It's a special episode.
Yeah,
right
but
now.
they've had a lot of experience helping Eastern, former Soviet puppet states and in Eastern Europe to guide them into the framework of Western governance. It hasn't always been perfect, but it's been pretty darn successful as a general rule, whereas our attitude has been, let's find all the nasty stuff we can and use that as political capital to hedge against and to apply conditionality even to security and military assistance. So, and actually, I was just looking through the where the money has gone in Ukraine aid, and all the departments have Inspector General Operations, DoD, State, so on and so forth. GAO has, part of the Ukraine supplemental has gone to fund GAO checkers for Ukraine. I just really fear we're headed down a similar path where it isn't really oversight, it's more gotcha.
So Tamar, if I may, before you react to this, I wanted to sort of attach a distinct but related question that also connects to what you said about empowering civil society, which has been one of the sort of main prescriptions of the report which you just did. There is a challenge on the right in the United States when it comes to empowering foreign country civil societies, because for many people on the right, civil society is oftentimes used as a shorthand for a range of woke, progressive social causes and organizations. And I've heard this argument from the Ukraine skeptic crowd, not least from our friends at the Heritage Foundation, saying that it should not be the role of the United States to be funding civil society, that maybe we should give them weapons, but let the Europeans deal with civil society. And then there is a massive sort of resistance on the right against aid to Ukraine writ large. And I think the more they can point to examples of aid going to causes they don't like, the more energized that opposition to Ukraine aid gets. So the question is how you sort of navigate that sort of perilous political environment in this country.
Yeah, no, I understand that concern, and I understand your concern as well, Giselle. And I don't know the ins and outs of the U.S. bureaucratic side clearly as well as you do. What I would say about I would just let me back up for a second and sort of say, what are the stakes here and what does America really want in Ukraine? A gray zone, corrupt country without a real market economy, without political parties and a robust democratic state. Corrupt, unmoored geopolitically, next to as what's between Russia and Europe, that would be much worse than Russia taking over. Right. So for want of a better word, these institutions building the democracy, creating a vibrant, healthy, democratic market economy is as much in our security interests as getting the Russian troops out. And so I think to sort of say, well, we're going to give them military aid and good luck with the rest, I think that's a mistake. So I think these issues of yes, there'll be a problem in persuading political factions, more than factions, political sides here to support the right help in building a new country. And yes, there's danger we could do it wrong, but I don't think we can just say, oh, let the Europeans do that. We've done our part. We sent them some missiles. We're done. I don't think we've accomplished the point if we do that. So I'm not gainsaying your concerns. I'm sure they're very real and a good corrective to my paper, but I don't think we can sort of give up on that.
One of the things that really struck me early in the war, Tamar, was your reporting from Irpin. Certainly, I'll only speak for myself. I was very forcefully reminded this past weekend, just because of the sheer cruelty and barbarity of the Hamas attacks on Israel. I mean, this is something we've wanted to make an episode about in recent months, to draw attention not away from those atrocities, but to remind people that atrocities have occurred of a quite brutal character and on a really, arguably even a larger scale, if you just sort of add them up in some crude way, in Ukraine, perpetrated by not only Russian troops, but Wagnerites and, even the militias of the puppet republics in the Donbass. I'd be interested in, because that's a subject that you've devoted some attention to, what your thoughts are in that regard.
Yeah, so I'm not a international lawyer, right? And the fine distinctions about what's a state and what's a terrorist, and when have you declared war, and when is it just murdering civilians for the sake of murdering civilians? So I don't want to pretend to speak to that with any authority. But everybody on all sides in both these conflicts calls the other side terrorist. You might notice, like everyone tries to delegitimize the other side by calling them terrorists. But I would certainly say, those caveats aside, that the brutality, the sort of no holds barred brutality and real disregard for civilian life, and certainly even using civilian life as something to be not quite as a weapon, but as something to be destroyed as a weapon. That's certainly parallel. I mean, I visited near the front a couple of weeks ago, and the city of Orikhiv is a small town kind of about 30 miles from the fighting, from where the breakthrough was on the southern front near Zaporizhia. And I'd been to Orikhi before, and when I was last there in May, it was pretty badly destroyed, but there was still a lot of buildings standing. It still looked like a city, and I wasn't able to actually get in this time. The cordon of military whatever was right outside. But I met quite a few people who'd fled and saw their videos and their photos and heard their stories, and it looks like those cities in Syria that were reduced to rubble, in previous Russian-aided conflicts. Just literally a city now that's bricks on the ground and stones on the ground. And when you hear about what the Russians were trying to do, or still are going to try to do again this winter with the hitting the electricity grid. The idea wasn't just that they would knock out the electricity. The idea is that people would be without water, that disease would run rampant through the cities. I mean, just unbelievable cruelty and barbarity. So never mind the random soldier, shooting and raping. I mean, we don't like that either. But this is, at the level of leadership thinking, how can we use civilians as pawns in this game?
On that note, a question about what Ukrainians are expecting in the next few months. You're closer and nearer to what is going on than any of us are here. And so it's last fall and winter, we were all fearing exactly what you mentioned, attacks on critical infrastructure, especially energy and electricity. To what extent is that relevant this winter? What are people fearing as we're ending the summer part and we're going into the winter season in terms of the counteroffensive as well? And in terms of Russian attacks and Russian cruelty, there's been here and there, we never know whether it's disinformation or not. We're hearing about North Korean weapons and amplified offensives from the Russian side planned before the end of the year. What are people saying and what are people fearing in Ukraine?
Well, I'm going to get to that, but let me just say one thing, what your question brings to mind for me. What do people fear most right now? That the U.S. will cut off aid. Like the front that matters right now is here, is on Capitol Hill, is in American politics. You ask what people fear, that is what people fear. That is what people talk about. People do expect intensified attacks on the electricity and the energy grid. They think that they haven't been able to repair fully what was damaged last year. They tried, they worked hard, but repair is difficult. New is easier than repair, apparently. I know nothing about it, but they go in with a lot of damage, and they're expecting the Russians to double down on that. There hasn't been an air raid in Kyiv in a couple of weeks now, and I think everybody thinks it's because they're stockpiling the weaponry. I'll just tell you, I bought something that looks like a car battery that I'm hoping will, keep my microwave going. And then my building, thank God, bought a generator. But everyone is expecting it. Everyone is expecting it to be worse than last year. But what they say, it's Ukrainian, it's Ukraine. They say, we got through it once, we'll get through it again. At least this time we can prepare. But it's certainly, I think, everybody will be a little surprised if it doesn't occur, and people are just getting ready. You buy buy couscous, buy canned goods, get your power station. If your building can get a generator, everybody's just getting ready.
So you invoked this question of further U.S. assistance to Ukraine. You have just spent a couple of days in Washington, including on Capitol Hill, speaking to staffers and members, trying to educate them about the situation in Ukraine. I think it might be useful to, get from that experience your sort of impressionistic view of where things are in the light of the chaos on the Republican side with the speakership contest and the dismissal of Kevin McCarthy with the continuing resolution that didn't include a provisions for help to Ukraine, and also in the light of the most recent events in the Middle East, which might also warrant some form of U.S. assistance to Israel. So are you optimistic, pessimistic? Are there sort of signs of hope? Are there things, arguments that people are receptive to, especially on the Republican side? What's your take on where things are headed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm deeply worried. Let's say that, in the optimistic, pessimistic, I'm deeply worried because I think the war is going to go on, for some time, and even in the best case scenario, I worry that the U.S. will falter. But my conversations, it was a small smattering of conversations, and quite scattered across the political spectrum. And in very recent days, I was up there on the day that I guess the day after McCarthy was, as you say, dismissed, a good word for it. And also I was up there yesterday. So people were kind of reeling from the news and I think still absorbing what's happening in the Middle East, as sort of the news came out. So I don't have any definitive view of it, but I would say that people do seem quite confident that the Senate will get it together, and the threat is in the House. And people seem across the board to be telling me that it's only a few people who are really so skeptical that they want to block it. But of course, even if, under the rules that we live by now, even a few people can block things and can maneuver. But the sort of sense was overall, even ours in the House kind of get it. The problem is they're under pressure politically, and the few who were adamantly opposed have very loud voices. But so, I mean, that situation, I'm not a Hill mastermind, but that situation would suggest that if you do it right, maybe you can get something through. And it is, I think, probably about packaging. And is it about packaging with the Middle East? Is it about packaging with some kind of border measure? What a lot of Republicans talked about that. Democrats didn't seem so open to it, but they haven't started negotiating yet. I mean, the challenge is that they don't negotiate on the Hill anymore. As somebody said to me, we don't talk about anything. We didn't even have conversations about, McCarthy didn't even come to Democrats behind the scenes to ask for a few votes last week. So, if we can't talk to each other about keeping the government open, how are we going to talk to each other about, Ukraine aid? But I think my hope would be a package, and my hope would be, I think, Republicans, one of the smartest things anyone said to me on the Hill was, Republican rank and file don't want to have to take votes on this. They it doesn't look, it's not a good look at their constituents. So, let's put it together a package that's hard to decline for other reasons and rip the Band-Aid off and try to get it done. I don't know if that's the best idea. I'm not in a position to absolutely recommend that, but that did certainly has occurred to me on the basis of the few meetings I've had.
Well, that is informative. And here is to hoping for a good omnibus that can get Ukrainians what they need.
I remember the year they called it the Kromnibus, so I forget what that was supposed to be, but maybe they could call it that again.
I feel also that the best thing that Ukrainians can do right now, apart from, of course, fighting the right fight, is not the fight against corruption, not anything else, but learning about the Hill. That's the best thing they can do.
Well, I mean, I think it would make a big difference in that debate, personally, if the people who, I remember the questions McCarthy asked when Zelensky was coming. He said, he didn't say absolutely no. He said, I want to know what the plan is. And I think, if we had a better, I think the Ukrainians have a very clear definition of victory, but I don't think the Biden administration has put forward a clear plan of victory. And I don't know if it's the Biden administration alone that should be putting it forward, but, maybe if the West collectively had a much clearer definition of victory and at least some kind of a plan about how we were going to get there, I think it would be a very persuasive argument. And, I think there are people who are going to say no and under any circumstances, and for whom those questions are just an excuse. But I think it makes there is a way in which we're going to help them as long as it takes, isn't that persuasive. And, I think it's also true that we've, I'm not the only person, I'm certainly not the only person who said this. Many people have been saying it for more than a year, but that we've given them enough to make sure Russia doesn't win, but not enough for Ukraine to win. And I think we need to come up with a definition of winning and make it push to give them enough to win. I mean, the counteroffensive is stalled on the ground, but it's not stalled in the Black Sea, in the seas of Azov, and we don't even talk about that really. So the Ukrainians are still resourceful. They still feel they have momentum. They have ideas. They just don't have the right weapons. And I think we need to define the end game and give them the tools to get there.
No, I was just going to say it seems in that vein that there is stonewalling from the administration. You are right. We have to see differentiated. Some are using it as an excuse, definitely, But hey, Biden promised a speech after the ousting of McCarthy, and that never happened. And it would have been the first and only speech on Ukraine to the United States. So,
I mean, I'm not sure Biden's best spokesperson, right? I mean, I'm not the first person.
Well, he knocked it out of the park with the Israel support.
Although there too, right? People are saying, I mean, that he's doing enough to he sounds good, but his main
Now to show me the money.
His main fear has always been, in both cases, is a wider war, and rightly so. Like, we don't want a wider war, but I'm not president. I'm sure those are hard decisions, but in Ukraine, I just think it's time to say what we want and try to get there.
I think we all agree with that. The problem is that there is this tension in the administration and among many people that it's on one level easy to say that yes, we want Ukraine to be restored to its 1991 borders with Crimea and everything, but we are not willing to take steps in that direction for fear of some kind of uncontrolled escalation. And so unless people are willing to sort of take those steps, then it doesn't really help that you say that you want Ukraine in 1991 borders. And that's, the way they are sort of dodging it is by saying, well, we'll do whatever it, support Ukraine for how long it takes. And that's just not good enough.
But I mean, eventually it's going to come to that, Putin hasn't, the fears of escalation haven't been borne out, till now. And I mean, I'm not saying there are no fears, and I'm not saying it's not real and it's a real issue. We can't, there are lines that we can't cross. But I don't know. I feel like, smarter minds than I can, could start moving in that direction. I mean, I'll just tell one more vignette from the front. And I think I've told you this, Dalibor, forgive me, but, I was at the front, as I say, 2 weeks ago, and I didn't actually go to where the shooting was, but I spent an evening in a little house where soldiers coming to the city sleep when they're going to the doctor or taking a train, whatever. And I sat in the kitchen, which is kind of family-sized kitchen, as they, filed in and out, just getting a bowl of soup or whatever, and talked to them. And they were utterly exhausted. Well, let me say this. Before I went there, before that evening, I thought that the day U.S. military aid ended, the war would end about 2 weeks later. I mean, I hope that doesn't happen, but that's how it would go. The guns would, the missiles would stop, the ammunition would stop arriving, and Ukraine would just say, well, that's it, can't go any further. But so I talked to these men, and they were in a very bad way, right? They were exhausted. They'd been on assault duty for months, many of them. They took pictures out their phones, and they showed you pictures of the day they went out with 11 men and came back with 3, and their own APCs and ribbons, and they didn't really have a theory of winning. They were throwing themselves at a brick wall and didn't really see what was going to happen. And so I said at one point, after quite a lot of this, I said, well, it sounds awful. Like, I hate to say this, but is it time to start thinking about negotiation? And they practically spit at me, to a person. And it was a kind of middle-aged man who said to me, if I don't get this done, my son is going to have to fight and maybe die for it. I have to get it done. I have no choice. And, what that suggests to me is that the U.S. aid, if it ends, they will continue fighting. They are going to fight till the last man. Basically, they are going to bleed out. And, it's a horrible notion. But, up till then, I kind of thought, well, we control when this war begins and ends. I don't think we control when this war begins and ends, but we do control, in many ways, what the outcome could be.
And we certainly have the power to bring the end forward.
And better. A better outcome.
Well, on that note, Tamar Jacobi, thank you so much for joining us on the Eastern Front.
Thank you for having me.
From my friends
Giselle Donnelly and
Julia Joja.
And me, Dalibor Raj, thank you for listening to the Eastern Front, podcast dedicated to security challenges that have erupted along the line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, aei.org, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please do get in touch with us on Twitter using the hashtag EasternFrontPod, written as one word, and don't forget to sign up for the Eastern Front's newsletter through the link included in the show notes to receive more content from the Eastern Front. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. Thank you and goodbye.